Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Actually, in the official program, this almost is not there. And then I saw that I failed at my first objective to have the longest talk title, and I had to add something. So, yes, first success. So my name is Marko, and I will talk about our last Angular project. I must warn you in advance, it might be slightly opinionated. Just might. A few words about me. I started programming more than 20 years ago. I changed technology stacks every few years, sometimes even months. I've done everything from Java, applets, midlets, PHP, JavaScript, Android, and for the past few years, TypeScript, Angular, and now again Java and React in front end. And I'm a specialist for blue enterprise applications. I just had a discussion with some people yesterday, and somehow most of these enterprise applications have some bluish color, so I don't know why. Currently, I'm working as a senior developer for Willhaben. It's the biggest Austrian marketplace, and I am a co-founder of Angular Austria Association. There are some stickers at the sticker table with this. This is France, the last emperor, and so you can take them. There are stickers with Angular Austria, Angular Vienna, and RuhrJS from us. And I have a question about you. How many of you have done some production Angular applications? Wow, almost half of you. And how many of you would do it again if you had to? Almost all of them. I'll try to change your mind in the next 20-something minutes and to convince all of you that Angular is a great choice as a technology. Told you I might be slightly biased there. And this was also as a feedback for me to know how deep do I have to go in explaining Angular concepts. My motivation for this talk was that, as I said, I worked for 3 or something years on an enterprise Angular project. And I wanted to share our experience, pains, and transfer some knowledge. One feedback was from which I received earlier for this talk is that I should add a timeline. So I had some facts and some funny slides, but how they happened. And then I found this one, which explains it quite well. We had this actually as a poster on our wall during these few years. And I tried to put some of our highs and lows on it. So at the beginning, we got our proof of concept working. We were very happy, top of the world, etc. But then we started doing some more complicated things. And at the time when we started, there were no tutorials. And we were on our own and had to figure out a lot of on ourselves by debugging and looking at source code. Then we managed to get validation to work. We were very happy about it. But then we started getting some funny errors in the console in development mode. I'll get back to it later. Then we got ahead of time compiler to work, but it's slow because we had to invest a lot of effort there. But it brought great performance improvements. Oops. And so on. Let's begin with our project. As already said, it was an enterprise application used in back office of a huge transport company. I'm not allowed to say which company it is. I can only say it was a railroad transport company. And it was a legacy app with about 200 screens, written in custom JavaScript framework and jQuery. So it's technology stack. There was this JavaScript framework and jQuery in front end, Node.js and Express in middleware, and the Mongo in the database. And there were very, very complex dynamic forms, sometimes with multiple nested tabs and data tables. And the maintenance and extension were painfully slow because this custom framework had a lot of magic strings, which you had to get in the right order in order to make it work. And also, it was a proprietary framework, and the company had to pay license fees each year, so the decision was made to rewrite the front end in the more modern technology. At the beginning, we had an evaluation, and we had to select which framework to go with, and we accessed it in a scientific manner, so we built one page in both frameworks at the time, with Angular and with React, and then we evaluated our findings and talked about pros and cons of each approach, and at the end, we decided to go with Angular, spoiler, and why? Actually, none of us liked this JS6 syntax with HTML embedded in JavaScript. It just felt unnatural. And all the other projects at the enterprise had Angular too. And we also had some experience with Angular from previous projects. So we went with Angular. We also defined an upgrade strategy. We didn't want to go with the big bang because they almost always bring problems. We decided to serve parallel routes from Node for the legacy app for the new Angular application, and just switch pages on the fly. So we could also have a parallel solution for one page until we proved that it was OK, and then just remove the old routes. And it worked well, for the most of the part. One downside to this approach was that we always had to keep backwards compatibility, and also sometimes there were very funny data structures which we had to fill and to go something like this in order to make it work with the Angular solution, but for the most part it worked well. And the idea is when all the screens are done, just remove the old routes and the source folders and throw a big party. So, obligatory meme, we had our upgrade strategy, we had our framework of choice, and we had to begin. I'm the one on the left. If you didn't recognize me, we were 3 developers at the beginning, and we went off on our way to Mordor. As I already said, we started with an early Angular beta version. So we were one of the first enterprises to have it in production. It was very brave of us. And I must say, at the time when we started doing it, average tutorials were something like this. Probably know this picture. And can feel how it goes. And even now, so there is a lot of quality content. But at official docs and examples, you have this as one of the more complicated form examples. So see, you have even 2 input fields and 1 select box. And what we had to rebuild was something like this. I don't know if you can see, so there are tabs with nested elements who can also spread, and you can have as many of them as the user wants. So there are repeaters with unlimited number of elements, but still. And if you can notice something, this original app was with red theme. It was completely new territory for me. As I said, I knew only how to build blue applications until this point. So we started building it, and at the time when we started, there were very few tutorials, and I must say here, so there are 2 types of forms in Angular. There are template-driven forms, and this is one example, where you have this double bracket syntax, which does 2-way data binding between Angular model and the template. And it means if you type something in this form element, then model value will be automatically updated. And also, if model value is updated, then it will be automatically shown on screen. And so this syntax is template-driven form. And another approach is to define your form elements in TypeScript in your controller, and then control validation, etc. from your controller. And normally, you would use either one or the other, but we learned it a lot later. So when we added validation, it looked something like this. So you can see on the end, we have this form control name, and it is a concept from a reactive approach. So we didn't use one or the other, we used both of them, which was a bad thing. Because, so until version 7 of Angular, it was just frowned upon. So you should not do it, but it worked for the most part. Sometimes you would get something like this. the fabulous expression has changed after it was checked error, and it actually happened only in the development mode, because Angular does 2 change detection cycles in the development mode, and if values of the model change between those 2 cycles, then it's a sign that you are doing something wrong and should look into it. In production mode, you never see it, and it worked for most of the part, but it kind of bothered us and just doesn't look clean. So, how do we solve something like this? In Angular, there is this wonderful change detector ref concept, and it's a class that it's an object that you inject in your component, and then can manually control how the Angular change detection works. And there are 2 relevant methods for this, mark for check and detect changes. It took me a long while until I learned to differentiate between them, and I found this wonderful illustration. So mark for check does, when you call mark for check, it marks the current component for check and all the components in the tree which are above it, and detect changes does it the other way around. So it marks the current component and all its children for change detection. So you have these 2 methods, and tutorial said, so if you have this wonderful exception, then just use change detector ref, and there are these 2 methods. So I will try one. If that didn't work, I'll try the other one. When that didn't work, just put both of them and hope that it works. I don't want to play with framework. It's cool and stuff, but I want to deliver some features. And when that didn't work, what did I do then? What would you do? Maybe it was the other way around. Sometimes even that didn't help. Now what? I read all the answers on Stack Overflow. I read the mailing lists. I even asked some questions. No response. What do? Just sprinkle change detector ref all over the code and hope that it works. And most of the part we got to insert it at the right point, and it worked. But still, this question mark, was this the real solution? Nah. What we did eventually, much eventually, we rewrote all our forms to use the reactive approach, and those exceptions then were gone. And while we were at it, we also changed most of the components to use the change detection strategy on push, which actually tells Angular, do not update this component until its inputs change. So internal state can change, but Angular ignores it until you either call the change detector ref and update the component, or until its inputs change. And so it was a bit of effort, but now we have a clean solution. Yes. That's not me. Another funny thing. So, as Carol in the previous talk said, so it's simple. It's just JavaScript. We had the JavaScript on the client, actually TypeScript, but it compiled to JavaScript. We had the JavaScript on the server and JavaScript in the database. Of course, we went with Mongo because we like playing with new toys. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler, everything that can go wrong will actually go wrong. What happened in this case, we used some helper fields in our models in the GUI. And at the beginning, we used native Mongo driver from JavaScript, and we just stored entire objects in the database. And it worked perfectly well. We didn't see any errors, and we shipped our first few versions. And these helper fields actually broke some systems down the pipeline who were using our data, and it was a bit embarrassing. So how did we solve it? We added Mongoose to our project. It's a framework which adds model validation, allows us to define data models, required fields, to ignore unknown fields, etc. And so it adds another layer of complexity, but at the end, there are many more benefits than costs. So problem solved. So, as I said, we started with an early beta version of Angular, and those were fun times. And the idea was always, when there's a new version available, just upgrade package.json, and you get all these cool new features. And for most of the part, it worked perfectly well. So we reserved a few hours or a day for this task, and it went far. It was simple. Of course, there were some minor issues, such as animations moving to their own package in Angular 2 final version, and some problems with libraries not following Angular releases, so which we had to either change libraries. For example, draggable library, we had to drop it and write our own. But it's another story. One time, this upgrade was much fun. Actually, this is just one of about 10 to 100 screens of red messages. And it was to illustrate it a bit more, it was a switch to ahead-of-time compiler. Originally, we used the just-in-time compiler. It was the default at the time, and it compiles your code as you are executing it. And it worked just fine. But ahead-of-time compiler brings many benefits, such as tree shaking, which means it doesn't package parts of your application or of other libraries which are not used, so tree shaking, minifying, etc. But what it does, it compiles the entire application at the beginning. Even HTML and CSS, everything gets compiled to JavaScript and minified. And for that, you had to do some preparation. And what did we do so wrong that we had these 100 screens? As I said, we were 3 experienced developers, which you saw on this beautiful photo. And we tried to use best programming practices. Always when I work, I try to also to follow a zero warning policy from the IDE. And one of the best programming practices is to define all of your variables as private as possible. So we had a lot of private variables. And for some reason, for some undocumented reason, Angular ahead-of-time compiler expected all of these variables to be public. It was quite easy to fix. So we just did a shotgun approach and replace all in path, all privates with nothing. And so 99% of those error screens were gone, problem solved. But there was another problem, which was a bit more interesting. And in the bootstrapping of our application, we had to use some values from the server. And in order to get them, you had to use HTTP module from Angular. It's down on the bottom. And as you can see, it's underlined as unused, so we removed it. And with just-in-time compiler, it worked perfectly well, but ahead-of-time compiler requires it explicitly to be there. So at the end, I swallowed this warning, found what was missing, and added it there. But there were some completely cryptic messages. I think it took me some 2 days of trying out different stuff, reading forums, and etc. And yeah, we invented a word for it, Probiergrammieren in German. But it worked very well, and at the end there were many performance improvements. I will come to that later. Let's go on to the next topic. As I said at the beginning, we had a lot of very complex data tables with much data, so we decided to go with a commercial solution. There's also a community version of AG Grid. AG stands for agnostic, so you can use it with plain JavaScript, with React, with Angular, or whatever you want. And it worked surprisingly well. Of course, they also rebuilt their code a few times. They renamed the main package, changed the in-memory raw model, but it was always done within a few hours, and it was OK. But one funny problem which I found was that from one version to the other, actually our tester found it, none of us developers and users saw it. From one version to the other, they reversed this arrow direction for ascending, descending sorting. And I traced it to their code, and the commit message was reversed arrow direction without a reason or Jira issue or something like that. And it actually started a really interesting discussion. What is the right direction of this arrow? So if you have ascending sorting, arrow points up, but your data goes from A to Z down, shouldn't it be down? There's no conclusive answer. But a funny problem. So this is the example of the original data grid in the legacy solution, and there were always these few predefined columns. And in order to add a new column, you would have to add some 10 files or edit some 10 files with the strings, and it was very easy to do it wrong. And this is the last version, in which there was, we said we were flexible and asked the user what do they want. They wanted everything. So at the end, this grid had some 32 columns, I think. But AG grid allows us, so this gives this menu, so a user can choose which columns do they want to have shown and in what direction. It's all draggable, droppable. And what I did there is to save this user's configuration in local storage, so when they visit the page again, they have just their own data, filtered, sorted, and displayed the way they liked it. So it was much better than the other one. And you might have also noticed, so I said at the beginning, I was very, very excited to work on something completely wild, different. This was a red application. And in the final version, we got help from a designer, and she said, no, red is bad, use blue. So it's my destiny to work with blue applications. So now on some complicated forms. So this was one of the forms with not that visible data. And we rewrote it to use editable table for this repeatable data, and it was much easier to comprehend and to see where you actually are and what you're editing. Another one was this monster form, and we added this left menu instead of another tab list, and it also has breadcrumbs which tell the user exactly where are they, what they're editing, so it's much more usable and user-friendly. Now a few words on performance. Angular was in the past very often bashed for its lack of performance, and I must say it has been greatly improved in the past few years. This is an example of main product table with some 4,000 items. And there's also item groupings and trees and etc. And in the original solution, it took about half a minute to load this monstrosity. And in the final version of with the Angular 7, we managed to cut it down to under 2 seconds. How we did it? These items are very complex in nature. They have nested objects with different with data for different time slices. So, for example, you can define data which is active now and for the next 6 months, and then in the next 6 months something can change, for example, prices or something else, and these changes are automatically applied when the time changes. So you can have as many of these time slices as you want. And that's why this object tree was so big. So what I did there in order to improve performance was I implemented something like a poor man's GraphQL. I loaded just current time slide with just the required fields. And so greatly reduced the amount of data which was loaded, and also added server-side caching. So at the end, it was quite an improvement. A few words on things which I would do differently if I were starting such a project now from scratch. So one of the things that has beaten us over and over was that we were mixing these template-driven and reactive forms, and that was a bad idea. And we somehow pulled it along for a few years. But nowadays, if you were starting something like that with Angular, you cannot do it. This mixing of those two types of forms is deprecated, and you get a nice exception if you try to do it. And also another good idea would be to use immutables or Redux in order to avoid accidental changes to the model. So if you have different parts of your application which touch the same data, we had a few times where we accidentally overwrote some changes, and those were not so spectacular, so I don't have them on my slides. But still, using some kind of immutability would help a lot there. Few words on general room for improvement, what I would like to see in the next versions of Angular. And what I greatly missed was something like a lightweight component creation, something like styled components in React. It was a killer feature for me as I started using React. I couldn't believe it could be so simple. But I must say, so the next Angular compiler, which is called Ivy, there is something in that direction. So there are higher order components and functional components. So right now in the current Angular version, each component has to live in a module, and it's kind of cumbersome. If you have some small components, you have to define modules for them or have some general modules, whatever. And also another thing which bothered us a lot is that compiled code was ugly to the point of unusability, and it was very hard to debug because all this HTML is also compiled. And also it's another thing which was fixed in Ivy. So in Ivy, this compiled code is much, much nicer. And one last thing there is that the ecosystem is still very young and often unstable, but it doesn't affect only Angular. Also React entire JavaScript ecosystem is a bit flaky. Like when some private person decides they don't want to have their npm package anymore, they remove it and then half of internet crashes the next day. So there's a bit of room for improvement. Now my favorite quote: "An expert is a man who has made all the mistakes which can be made in a very narrow field," by Niels Bohr. Or for the younger ones among you, "Believe in yourself and grow from your mistakes," by Taylor Swift. A few closing thoughts. I really, really liked the community and the ecosystem. There is a special kind of energy at JavaScript events that is not present in other programming events that I visit. And nowadays, there's a lot of high-quality content for each level. And I really liked working with TypeScript. It brings us type safety where we need it, everywhere. But also, if you have to hack something really quick and just try if it works, you can just use any type and then add your types later. One thing which I would say that Angular excels is that it has excellent forms support out of the box, the best of all frameworks that I tried. Because if you have deeply nested forms, as in our case, and some lowest level input field is invalid, then entire form is marked as invalid, and it's working perfectly out of the box. And also, performance has performed drastically. It was marvelous to see how from one version to the other, the performance was sometimes better for 20 or 50%, and we just updated a few lines in package.json. It was amazing. And I must say, I had a lot of fun in the past few years, and I'm very happy that we went with Angular. I said it might be slightly biased. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be happy if you catch me after or send me a message on Twitter. As I said, there are some stickers outside at the sticker table, or come to me directly. I have some more. Thank you.